Welcome to Special Investigations. Today's episode, Roswell, hosted by Jaime Maussan.
Some say that the first nuclear test on Earth at Trinity site in the state of New Mexico was the common denominator for the presence of so many unknown flying objects in the area. It was evident that unknown beings had great interest in the development and the construction of atomic bombs.
For years, I've heard these reports from credible veterans, and I've been frustrated that nobody in our government has tried to get the truth from the Air Force. And is this true? If you study the reports, it's not just a handful of people, but the UFO reports around those bases and facilities are very well documented. It's possible, and people need to bear this in mind, it could still be kept secret because it's in a classified context, right? But it's so explosive that if word starts to get around, it could be a very hard secret to keep, one. And two, if Congress finds out, there are some members of Congress who may say the American people have a right to know. There's no doubt in my mind that the evidence is very, very compelling that somebody is flying craft that we don't understand, that we are incapable of manufacturing ourselves. And our Freedom of Information Act has surfaced a lot of those documents. And if that proves to be the case, that is fascinating and amazing and probably very encouraging.
We gradually gained a better understanding of what happened in New Mexico between 1945 and 1948. According to witnesses, up to 5 alien ships crashed to the ground in the vicinity of Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory. The first incident occurred in San Antonio on August 16, 1945. The second occurred in Roswell on July 2nd and 3rd, 1947. The third occurred in Aztec on March 25, 1948. This occurrence was indicated by several declassified documents that the FBI is trying to discredit. The scientists in charge of the Manhattan Project complained about the regular intergalactic traffic of flying objects around the most secretive base in 1945.
So there is a document in Ryan Wood and Bob Wood's files from Majestic 12. It is a letter from Oppenheimer and Einstein called Relationships with Celestial Bodies, and it went to Truman in June of 1947, before Roswell. And it said to President Truman, we're having a situation with extraterrestrials and we need to put some protocols in place because we're seeing that they're coming. This is Einstein and Oppenheimer wrote this letter. It's in the MJ-12 documents. In those days, the scientists that were working on this knew very well that there were crashes, and they were photographs, and I have some of the men on the Trinity site with the mushroom cloud with UFOs in the background. This planet had discovered the nuclear age.
On July 16, 1945, the first nuclear bomb exploded a few miles from small towns and ranches, populated mostly by Mexican Americans and American Indians. The explosion released radioactive haze on nearby cattle ranches, and the flash was as intense as the sun. The mushroom of smoke and debris projected upward for 8 miles, a device with a power of 19 kilotons, the equivalent of 19,000 tons of TNT. Even though the test was a great success, and the explosion exceeded all expectations, the post-detonation consequences on the population were felt for generations. The mushroom cloud traveled northeast at about 10 miles per hour, activating Geiger counters in the city of Reed, 160 miles away from the detonation at Trinity. Scientists later discovered that the cloud had spread as far as the state of Indiana, 2,000 miles away. Observers were unable to make accurate measurements of the damage and the radiation to the environment because it was so high that it destroyed all of their instruments, bent meters, burned films, and fogged lenses with radiation condensation. Due to the force of the explosion, the desert animals turned into ashes on the cracked sand, and those who were far from the explosion fled in terror. The Manhattan Project was so secretive and the experiment so dangerous that the government decided not to inform the nearby inhabitants about the immediate danger they were about to face that summer morning. Some of the scientists feared that the atmosphere would catch fire and that the state would suffer heavy losses. The governor had a special program in place in case the inhabitants of his state needed emergency assistance. Although Oppenheimer had no idea of the repercussions of his bomb, he refused to express remorse for the New Mexico test. When neither he nor his colleagues could accurately predict the power of the weapon they had created.
Few people laughed, few people cried, most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
Were you there? Did you see the explosion on July 16th, 1945?
It was early in the morning there in Socorro. That's about 10 miles. I got up about that time. At that time they didn't have inside toilets and all that, so I felt like but I never did use a toilet. I saw that flash and then the boom. I went to bed. I didn't even tell my folks about it. And we heard on the radio that an ammunition dump had exploded. But you know, the funny part about it is they didn't let the people know what they were going to do, you know? They didn't know if that thing was going to tear up the whole world.
Jose Padilla and Remy Baca, two little boys of 9 and 7 years of age in 1945, were victims, along with their families, not only of the effects of explosion, but the disinformation campaign launched by the government after the blast.
That morning, my mom and I went over because Stanislava also had a grocery store there, and so we went over there to get something that she needed, and as such. And there were soldiers in front of the store, you know, and so they were saying, "Oh, by the way, you know that sound you heard this morning? Yeah. Well, some explosives, you know, there was some explosives in one of the houses over there in the places where they store them over at Alamogordo that exploded, and that's what you heard. And that's what we believed. Until they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August I think it was the 6th and the 9th.
Jose Padilla was only 9 years old in 1945. His home was only a few miles from the nuclear blast, and he experienced firsthand the effects of the explosion. However, it was his mother who suffered permanent damage directly related to the atomic test.
See those bumpy hills there? That's Trinity side. Over to the left of there, that's where the entrance is. They used to call it Stallion side before. Our ranch is down on this gully right here to the right-hand side, about 4 miles. It is too close. Because that's when my mother, you know, we seen when that bomb exploded there. When she looked out through the door and then she got blind from that eye. My mother lost the sight of that eye, you know, when she was looking at there. But she lost it from the resplendent of that explosion. It took about 3 minutes for the wind, hot wind, floating up this way. That was a radiation. I just felt a strong blow. Well, no, I jumped underneath the bed. Then about 3 minutes later, I came out. That's when everything was kind of silent, and we seen an airplane flying over our ranch, coming up this way. I guess they were checking out, see if there was any damage. 2 weeks later, that's when they had the meeting over at the Owl Bar Cafe there, telling the government, telling all the people, all the ranchers over here, that it was a ammunition dump that had blown up.
22 months and 17 days after the first unidentified flying object landed in San Antonio. News reports loudly promoted the fact that a second and possibly a third craft of unknown origin had fallen to Earth in Roswell, New Mexico. On July 8, 1947, the front page of the Roswell Record proudly announced the capture of an identified flying saucer at a nearby ranch. The news quickly expanded worldwide, causing a great deal of concern to the United States Military High Command. Mark Brazel, a rancher, discovered the remains of an unknown object, a metallic craft that possibly crashed on his property the night of July 3, 1947. He arrived early in the morning and to his surprise found debris covering a square mile belonging to a flying disc that might have exploded in the sky. Even though it is considered a historical site, there are no plaques or signs of any kind. Today, its current owner kept it exactly as in 1947, and only a few experts know the exact location. After the break, we will visit the exact spot where the supposed crash landing of two different spacecraft took place, the hangar where the alien bodies were supposedly stored and shipped from, and the funeral home where the autopsies were performed. This is the same place where in 1947, Mark Brazel, a rancher, discovered the remains of an unknown object, a metallic craft that possibly crashed on his property the night of July 3, 1947. He arrived early in the morning, and to his surprise and that of his companion, he found debris covering a square mile, belonging to a flying object that might have exploded in the sky. Almost 8 decades later, we are in the same place where Mark Brazel supposedly found the alien ship. Debris that would spread after the impact. Just 2 days later, Brazel found a new crash site. However, he did not find any part of the craft, but he did find some alien corpses. The smell, the dead bodies, and an impression that would affect his life forever. Timothy D. Proctor, the son of his neighbor, accompanied Mark Brazel to the site, and together found strange material and remains that no one understood, that no one had seen before. The debris remains as unknown today as it was almost 80 years ago, according to the most recognized expert on the Roswell case, Donald Schmidt.
As long as he was only dealing with material here, he was making every effort. He was going into the nearest town of Corona. He went to his nearest neighbor, Floyd and Loretta Proctor, about 10 miles from here. And at the time in 47, he didn't have a television, no radio, no telephone. So he had no way of knowing that there were a lot of sightings going on. He didn't even know about the flying saucers. But one by one, they were all telling him it could be one of those flying discs they're talking about. And he still had no idea what they were really, describing. And he discovers this huge debris field of this bizarre, this strange material they had never seen before. The material itself was paper thin, practically weightless, but you couldn't dent it, you couldn't bend it, and the material that we still refer to as our Holy Grail, that it was the same paper thin-like material, but this you could crumble, you could crease, you could fold, you could wad it up, but you'd place it down and it would flow like water, smooth right out. And this is where it all happened. We're talking about the summer of 1947. Any of your viewers could go back and check all the newspaper accounts of that summer wave of flying disc activity. It was as though the country was being invaded. Banner headline after headline, one day after another. And New Mexico, which was the heart of all military activity at that time, we had just detonated the first atomic bomb in New Mexico. And you had that very squadron, the 509th Bomb Wing, which had just dropped 2 bombs on Japan 2 years before. They happened to be stationed at Roswell.
It happened. Sorry. It happened. It was here. Grandpa just, of course, he was horseback when he found them. He just picked pieces up of this and that and whatever and put it in his pockets. And Daddy, it was, I'm going to say probably 2, maybe 3 days later, picked up the same thing, little it was like aluminum foil. And Grandpa said you could fold it up and crease it and lay it out, and it would open right back up and not have any creases in it at all. Of course, I guess I was raised kind of in the old school, children are to be seen and not heard. But if we had questions, they were answered, just like when we found about all the aluminum and the balsa wood, and well, it was more exciting, you know. I mean, who would think you could take a piece of wood and try to burn it and it wouldn't burn? I mean, what kind of wood is that? But no, it just little things like that. But as far as the full scale, it was never discussed. It was, you know, little bits and pieces here and there. Well, he didn't realize. He had no conception that there was a spacecraft laying down here in the ditch somewhere.
The night before the crash, there had been a strong storm, and some considered that the ship had been hit by lightning and fallen to the earth. On the morning of Sunday, July 6, 1947, Mark Brazel grabbed the few pieces of the ship and took them to Roswell. He delivered them to Sheriff George Wilcox, who notified the military authorities of the Roswell Air Base. That strange remains of an aircraft had been discovered on Brazel's property. Colonel William Blanchard sent 2 military intelligence officers to investigate and recover any peculiar object scattered in the field. They arrived at this small shelter on the evening of July 6, 1947.
We're standing in front of the old ranch house. It was called, still is, the Hines House. And this is where, when Mac Brazel led the 2 intelligence officers, Major Jesse Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cabot, out to investigate the debris field. This is the area that the military then would come to and spend about 3 days, 50 to 60 men, on hands and knees, shoulder to shoulder, picking up every last piece. As one of the MPs said to us, they were told, if it doesn't move, pick it up.
In 1947, the object came in from this direction, northwest to southeast. It struck just on this side of this low rise you see there. It struck the ground there, skidded along, continued for 500 feet, making a gouge in the surface. Became airborne again and crashed 30 miles from here towards Roswell. This is where the soldiers were on their knees and they were locking arms and walking back and forth. Their orders were to pick up anything that's not natural, because as you can see, there's lots of wind, and this stuff was very light and would have blown all over the place. It had lain out in the field for 5 days before it was recovered.
I mean, when the military come out here, they were out here for days and days and days. They had trucks and trucks of guys out here, Dad said. And I mean, they were walking shoulder to shoulder. And if they even thought that it was anything to do with the crash, they picked it up. And they just didn't come once. They came back twice after that, too. The first hard rain we had, they were back out here again, going over it again. So, and from here all the way back to the highway that way.
Commander Jesse Marcel, the officer in charge of the debris operation and head of intelligence for the 509th Bombers Group in Roswell, brought some of the materials back to his home for inspection.
The very night that Marcel would return back from the debris field with his 42 Buick convertible full of debris, full of wreckage, the back seat, the trunk, he would wake his son, Jess Jr. and wife up, take them into the kitchen. And there he had wreckage. He had debris scattered all over the kitchen floor. Wanted them to see it before he took it all the way to the base. And it was there that Jesse Jr., examining one of the pieces, noticed some of the hieroglyphic-like symbology. Immediately, observed that, noticed that this was something that his father, had never seen anything like this before. And his father kept talking about pieces of a flying saucer, flying saucer craft.
Colonel William Blanchard assumed charge of the crash site immediately after the Roswell record reported the news around the world. Decades later, his daughter would reveal what happened the night of January 3rd, 1947.
Blanchard's daughter, Dale, describes that when her father came home late that night, that first night, that he was beside himself, that he, for being a big man, he played football, and there were little people, there were little men, and they weren't from here. And then he would say that they weren't from this earth. So the family described how when Blanchard came home, that this was something very unsettling, something that again defied conventional explanation.
The military could not contain the flow of information surrounding the Roswell case. Unlike San Antonio, a remote location, 150 miles away with only a handful of testimonies, the Roswell incident accounted for 750 witnesses. On Wednesday, July 9, 1947, the Roswell Daily Record published a new headline in which it denied its previous report and assured the public that the Air Force did not recover a flying saucer. Instead, they retrieved what appeared to be a weather balloon. However, our investigation would demonstrate, with facts and statistics, that the government began a disinformation campaign that ruined the lives of many of the witnesses, choosing to treat the phenomena as a national security threat. Your father, Walter Howard, was the public information officer and a key player in the Roswell case.
Well, he put out the first press release, so I'd say yes. I issued the press release saying basically we have in our possession a flying saucer, and it's being flown to higher headquarters. And typically he would end any conversation about the press release or about the incident by saying it was not of this earth.
When we come back, we will investigate further into the recovered craft, which according to Schmidt's account, included one with little damage, while another disintegrated when it fell to earth. Schmidt claims that they also found half a dozen non-human corpses about 3 feet tall, 2 in good condition, 2 more with considerable injuries, and at least one of them alive. The order from Washington was to silence the media at any cost. The military stopped all of the first-hand witnesses from disseminating the original version of events, imposing the weather balloon story as the new truth. The disinformation campaign was successful. The military carried on threats of physical harm to the eyewitnesses that continued for years. Mark Brazel, the first person to discover the crash, was the most affected.
They kept him here for 5 days after the weather balloon explanation, and they kept him what they called the guest house. And you see how it's all fenced in. And Brazel would complain afterwards that he felt as though he was in jail. They kept him up all hours of the night. They asked him the same questions over and over again. They didn't allow him due process. They didn't allow him to even call his own wife to tell her where he was, his boss, that he wasn't at the ranch running things. So he's kept here.
Grandpa felt an obligation to whoever he had talked to or whatever had happened not to discuss it, and he didn't. We were talking to Floyd Proctor, and he's the one that told me about the first time, told me about how they had taken Grandpa to Roswell and I won't say incarcerated him, but kept him there for almost a week. And then when I got back home, I asked Daddy about it. And Daddy said, yeah. He said, they kept Grandpa down there for quite a while. And he said, but that's the government's way of doing business.
Brazel was escorted by military personnel to the Daily Record and later to a local radio station. The same two media outlets he had visited days earlier, with a different story. Brazel retracted his testimony, claiming in both instances that he had exaggerated what he had seen at his ranch.
Frank Joyce, that original reporter who encouraged him to report it to the military, he sees a number of MPs, a number of military police, standing right outside the radio station, waiting for Brazel. Brazel, being the older of the two, says, "Son, they told me it would go awful hard on me if I didn't do exactly as they said." And Joyce says to him, "Well, what about the little green men?" And Brazel turns back and says, "They weren't green."
According to Schmidt, the ship pieces and the alien bodies were moved to Hangar P3, which in 1947 was known as the Black Hangar.
This is where it all happened, this very hangar. And some describe, for example, not only seeing areas where bodies were laid out, others would describe seeing an egg-shaped object, a pod, a capsule, about the size of a car, portions of this unknown object.
My dad was one of the soldiers or the military people that went out and picked the aliens up when they crashed here in 1947. When he was starting to pass, he had Agent Orange cancer from the military, from being in Vietnam. And he finally told us about it, told my sister and I about it, and said the government was trying to cover it up, that it had really happened. It's not something that was just fictitious, that it really happened. It wasn't a weather balloon, it was a crash site. He said that he went out and found that when they got there that he observed the crash site, a circular type ship crash site, and there was debris strewn everywhere, and that he had found 3 bodies. They had large heads on them, and at least one of them was still alive when they brought him back to the base.
The very first flight that transported actual wreckage from the crash site came through this building as the men escorted open boxes from the crash and came through a hallway, and there was a B-29 that taxied up, which was called Dave's Dream.
Schmidt's book details that the Lieutenant Governor of New Mexico in 1947, Joseph Montoya, arrived to the hangar and observed the beings recovered by the Air Force.
Was beside himself. He was distraught. He was upset. And then later, he would describe that he was taken into the hangar and he was shown what he thought were children. And he became immediately upset. And that's when he called for his friends to pick him up. And he would always warn them afterwards, if you ever repeat what I've told you, I will say you're a liar. And he would also warn them that I can't stop the FBI, I can't stop the government. So it was after he had passed away that they finally started to confide to us and repeat what he had originally told them, that they weren't human.
Thanks to the research of Don Schmidt and his partner Tom Corey, they were able to document testimonies from different witnesses. One of them at the hangar used to keep the remains.
One of our first 10 witnesses, Eli Benjamin, described how they were called and assigned to guard duty over at the hangar. A number of gurneys transporting a number of bodies. It was there that one of the MPs stepped on one of the sheets and it moved and the eyes opened. And he saw that clearly, it wasn't human. He gets very emotional when he talks about it because he can't forget the face, and that clearly it was something beyond this planet.
7 decades ago, the Roswell Hospital played a big role in the case. Doctors and nurses witnessed the arrival of an ambulance transporting injured patients that, according to the staff, were out of the ordinary.
Some were described even at the crash site as being burned, as being mangled. Some were described as uninjured, almost peaceful. They were very serene even in dying. And the surviving one was described at some point even walking on its own. The base administrator, his private secretary, Miriam Bush, described that when she was taken into an examination room, and then she saw one of them move, and she saw again the larger head and the larger eyes, and it was something that affected her as well for the rest of her life.
Glenn Ballard, owner of the only funeral home in Roswell, received several phone calls from the hospital with unusual requests. He was asked by the military to assist them at the hospital.
And Glenn's story was that at first the calls were as to the availability of child-sized caskets. Do you have any children's caskets? Okay, if that was believable. But then there were follow-up calls as to what type of chemicals could be used for the preservation of bodily tissue and bodily fluids.
After the break, we will return to the crash site and join a group of researchers and journalists from several countries to document an excavation searching for the remains of the spacecraft that crashed in 1947. We returned to the exact same spot where Mark Brazel discovered the remains of what appeared to be an unworldly craft 70 miles from Roswell. After negotiating special permission from the landowner, we joined a group of researchers in search of remains. The group was hoping to find a fragment that might have escaped the military and the erosion. This is the excavation site between Corona and Roswell, New Mexico, the property that Mark Brazel managed in 1947. The space has been divided into grids to avoid repeating the search in each of these squares.
We're going to lay out a systematic grid within 10-foot coordinates, and we're going to focus all the metal detectors on one specific square, move on to the next one. Oh, the chances are a needle in a haystack. That's always been the case. I mean, certainly the military and their confidence that they've always recovered everything. The military was still coming out here for 2.5 years after the crash. They would get on horseback, they would dress up like local cowboys and ride through the area. The rancher's son, Bill Brazel Jr., he found pieces here months after the occupation, only to have them recovered, taken away from him 2 years later. This is the general area that has been the erosion path through the last 66 years, and they've been scattered by as much as 200 feet, all suggesting a mid-air explosion of some sort. And so because we've already mapped out the site, we've laid out a grid in the past, and now it's to focus on this one area that's been the most promising.
Subtle but noticeable.
Okay, this one looks like it works.
I don't understand why people put this story down. As far as I'm concerned, it's the beginning of ufology in the modern era. It's almost where it all began. This story never goes away because the government lies and cover-up doesn't go away. Now they've admitted to lying at least 3 times, 4 different official versions. So to me, it's just as relevant today as it was 60-odd years ago. It's up to the people like Tom and Don to keep going until we get them. And then that's when we can stop, investigating and looking for clues. Until then, we have to keep going and it's still relevant. It only becomes irrelevant if we have the answers, and we don't have those answers.
Donald Smith and Tom Carey have been in the forefront of the Roswell case since 1991. As authors of several books on the subject that have been turned into movies, the current owner of the Brazel Ranch granted them special permission to continue digging for irrefutable proof.
Of course, I've been involved in all aspects of the case, and especially interviewing potential witnesses. And I've been to this site many times. This is the 3rd archaeological dig that I've been on here, because my background is anthropology and archaeology, and so I find that exciting. But the whole case, Jaime, is I'm 22 years on the case now. It's the only case, and I'm as excited about the case, investigating it today, as I was in 1991. And I do believe it's a historical event that just happens to be about a UFO. A lot of people, they say, oh, it's a UFO, and they turn their nose up at it. But to me, it's a historical mystery that needs solving. Of course, we found scores and scores, hundreds of witnesses, first and second hand, that have told us not about a balloon event that happened in this sheep pasture, but an event that involved an extraterrestrial vehicle with crew. And these are people from all walks of life, professional people, laborers, lawyers, military generals, military enlisted men, the whole panoply of life who were involved in this have each told us their little piece of the puzzle, and it's up to myself and Don Schmidt to put the little pieces of the puzzle together to solve it.
Fortunately, an object was found. It will be analyzed to discard the possibility that was manufactured on Earth. Or perhaps it could be actual evidence that could give more support to the Roswell case.
I haven't tried bending it or anything like that, but it's very light.
Well, it resembles artifact pieces that have been found not at this site, but down in the area we've been working since yesterday. Professor Kimbler has had the other pieces analyzed at two separate laboratories, and we still are waiting for a third analysis. On a radioisotope chart, there are specific elements that jump off the chart. They should not be there. They are not of any known manufacture. So in other words, it doesn't prove they're extraterrestrial, but they are not of any known manufacture here. It's over a dozen pieces now that have been found within the last year and a half. But we're keeping very low key, very quiet for the fact that until it is demonstrated as being something extraordinary.
After the break, we will return to Roswell and document several testimonies. Family members who heard from their parents in their deathbeds. The real truth of what happened in 1947. For decades, Donald Smith and Tom Carey have interviewed more than 750 witnesses. Many of them received deathbed testimonies from family members that kept the secret until shortly before they passed away. Unfortunately, most of the witnesses have already died. The documented testimonies are from elderly people who do so because they do not want to take the secret to their graves.
As he is giving his last testimony to his wife, and she describes this, and she starts to become emotional. And she says, he told me, he said, I want you to know I've always been true to you. I've always been faithful. And then he tells her about Roswell. He equated that. So in other words, that level of emotional attachment, his marriage, his faithfulness to his wife, was on the same level of importance as what happened in 1947.
Another similar case was that of Carlene Green. Her father had the highest security in the Air Force. 2 weeks before he died, he broke the secret that he had kept for more than 3 decades.
As they were getting ready to put him on the gurney to load him up, he told me, he said, he always called me his baby. He said, baby, don't ever let anyone tell you that that crash didn't happen. He said, it happened. I was out there, I saw the crash site, I saw the spacecraft, and I saw the grays. I knelt beside him and I kissed him. And I told him, Daddy, I love you. And I'll see you soon.
To see grown men cry, to well up and cry over something that, according to the government, was something so conventional, so recognizable as just being a weather balloon. So I'm at the point that I just can't accept that all these people are lying about this common thread describing this same incident. And my conclusion is that I am 99% convinced.
Another witness was a Korean War veteran who worked in the Strategic Air Command of the United States Armed Forces and had access to the Roswell secret files.
There were a few pictures in there showed 3 dead aliens and 2 standing, apparently alive. I have no way of knowing that. And I looked at the pictures, and I saw the pictures of the craft as they were taken after it had come to rest on the ground. I'll be honest with you, I regret deeply not being able to, not having read the entire report. There must have been a lot in there. Now, I am a firm believer that the government wants this kept quiet. The saucer existed. I saw the pictures of it. The back, well, I assume the back right-hand corner was gone. There was no way to determine if it was the front, the side, or the rear. I quit calling it a flying saucer because, yes, it looked like one, but it was actual spacecraft.
Some other witnesses insist that their families were threatened to make them silent. This was the case of Frankie Rowe, a little girl in 1947, whose father was the fire chief and a first responder at the crash site.
Probably in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was at the fire station the day the state policeman came by, and he had a piece of the material. And all of the firemen handled it and played with it, and when they were through playing with it, I got to handle it and play with it for a while. I would wad it up in my hand and then drop it on the table. And by the time it hit the table, it was totally flat. And it was so soft that it did not wrinkle, but it was like holding nothing in your hand.
According to Frankie, a few days after the crash, a military officer showed up at her house, threatening her and her family.
First tried to convince me I didn't know anything, I didn't see anything, and I didn't hear anything, and I kept insisting I did, because we were taught you couldn't lie. And he finally said, if that doesn't convince you that you can't talk about this, we can just take you out here and kill you in the desert. He said, it's a big old desert and nobody will ever find your bodies. So we'll just bury you out there and nobody will ever know you were ever here. We knew about Daddy going to the crash site because a few days before that, when he came home, he told us about it. But he said when we got there, we found a flying saucer had crashed. And he said they were already in the bags before they got there. And the little one that was walking around talked to them in their head. And that was a shock to all of the firemen. And he said, we don't mean anybody any harm. He said, there's nothing you can do. And that's pretty close to the point that the military got there and told them to leave, so they left. I guess the man really did impress me because I did remember what he looked like about 50 years after it happened. I could still see his face.
Frankie Rowe died in 2017. She was the last witness who claimed to have had in her hands one of the Roswell spacecraft's pieces. Frankie's dream before passing was that the government would acknowledge her experience and accept that the crash in Roswell was real.
I think someday the truth will come out, but it won't be in my lifetime. Because when Jimmy Carter was running for president, he promised to bring all the details out, but he couldn't. And I still think they're probably still watching us. They did tell Daddy they'd been watching us for a long time. And he said, we mean you no harm.
Our investigation put together the pieces of this extraordinary puzzle, one by one. We tried to understand the state of mind of those who were in charge of national security in 1947, 2 years after World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. The crash in Roswell was considered a national security threat and was dealt with accordingly. The possibility of beings with far superior technology lurking near Los Alamos Laboratory, and the supposed crash of several crafts of unknown origin near the most strategic base on the planet was a real threat, and silence had to be kept at any cost.